Hello everyone. I happen to be the chair of this session. I can just shortly introduce myself. I'm Louise Ravnlykke from Design School Kolding in Denmark. At the moment, I'm in Aarhus, the second biggest city in Denmark, on a very rainy fall-ish day. Yeah, sending my warmest wishes and hello to you out there. So I can see that we have 1.5 hours for presentations for the next for this session, and we are 4 to present, including myself. So this gives 15 minutes for each presentation and 5 minutes more or less for discussions in between. So, and here I propose some good Zoom meeting etiquette, where if possible use your video camera, so we can support a more rich discussion in during this session. This is somehow makes it more like we were there in France in person. So, but I can see that Sylvia is here, the first one who will present. So I think I will give the word to Sylvia to present her research project. I cannot hear you, Sylvia. I don't know if others can. No, there's no sound. Maybe you have to allow the system to use your audio. No, we cannot hear you.
Maybe
now I can hear something.
My name is Katja. I am in the technical support. Hi.
Yeah, hi Katja.
Hi, Sylvia. Probably is your mic is not well connected, the headphones. So you can try to unplug it and plug it again, and see in the end of the window in the microphone if it's the right micro that is plugged.
I think that now is working. Yes. Okay.
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you.
You have the word, Sylvia.
So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Silvia Blas Riesgo. I'm a PhD candidate from University of Navarra and ISEM Fashion Business School in Madrid. And I'm going to present our research, the consumption side of sustainable fashion, price sensitivity, value, and transparency demand. I think that while I am presenting, I'm going to have my camera off because my connection is not so good. But at the end for the discussion, I will put it on again. So. This is a brief summary of the presentation. The advent of fast fashion in the mid-70s and the globalization of markets have disrupted the pace of both fashion production and consumption. Global per capita textile production, for instance, has increased from 6 kilos to 13 kilograms per year over the period from 1975 to 2018. And the overall increase in clothing production demand is estimated to be approximately 2% yearly. Clothing prices have risen slowly compared to other consumer goods, which has contributed to make clothing more affordable. For example, despite an increase in the number of items owned, the average per person expenditure on clothing and footwear has decreased from approximately 30% in the 50s to 12% in 2009 to only 5% in 2020. Low cost facilitate the culture of buying more and more frequently and wearing items for less time. In that sense, we can say that fast fashion businesses have helped build up a throwaway culture, devaluating the garment's worth. Nowadays, people tend to dispose of worn and torn items because it is more convenient to buy new ones than to repair them. According to a 2018 report released by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, 85% of textiles, that is 21 billion tons, are sent to landfills each year. Consumers are purchasing more clothes and keeping them for half as long, driven by fast fashion, fast marketing, and a thirst for newness increased by social media. Similarly, the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion estimates that $500 billion of value are lost every year due to clothing underutilization and lack of recycling. In contrast, sustainable products can be defined as products that provide environmental, societal, and economic benefits while protecting public health, welfare, and environment over their full commercial cycle, from the extraction of raw materials to final disposition, providing for the needs of future generations. Accordingly, socially responsible consumption is the pattern of purchasing and consuming products that maximize long-term benefits and minimize hazardous effects on consumers and societies. On the consumer side, growing consumer concern about sustainability issues has been reflected in a willingness to pay higher prices for products and services provided by companies involved in social and environmental activities. However, despite increased awareness and concern, there has not been an evident correlation with sustainable fashion consumption. Thus, consumers have a positive attitude and increasingly care about unethical behavior, but this attitude frequently does not translate into action. Some research have termed this conundrum as the fashion paradox. Several studies have tried to identify the socially responsible consumer in terms of demographic characteristics. Thus, past studies have shown that, in general, women tend to be more involved in sustainability issues and practice it more often than men. Other studies have pointed out that the sustainable consumer is characterized by a high income, education, and social status, and nowadays it is believed that the younger generations are the most engaged in sustainable issues. In any case, researchers agree that demographics only are not enough to explain the socially responsible consumer, and that a further understanding of the consumers and their purchase decision process is needed. Within the literature, to our knowledge, limited research investigates the motivations driving consumers of sustainable fashion, questioning how much we actually know about sustainable consumption practice. Therefore, this research has the following objectives: to establish what is the consumer's perception and consumption of sustainable fashion in Spain, to deep into the knowledge of sustainable fashion consumers and their purchasing process, drawing a comparison with the average consumer, and to define the barriers and drivers for sustainable fashion, further contributing to the attitude behavior gap literature. As a methodology, in this research, we have followed a mixed method approach. Firstly, we gather data from 3 focus groups as a qualitative data collection method, and then we triangulated the data with a survey. Since this research is exploratory in nature, focus groups were the perfect technique to conduct a preliminary exploration of an under-researched area. So we held 3 focus groups in Madrid on July 2019. Each focus group session lasted for 90 minutes, and the focus groups were divided as follows. Group 1 with 8 participants and Group 2 with 9 participants included fashion consumers who had never bought sustainable fashion. We further divided the first and second groups by age, below 30 years old and above 30 years old. The third group included consumers who usually buy sustainable fashion, specifically 6 participants that were recruited via Fashion Revolution Spain, Slow Fashion Next, and the Spanish Association of Sustainable Fashion. On the other hand, the survey questionnaire presented 4 sections. In section 1, we explored the degree of fashion consciousness of participants using 3 measures: interest in fashion, frequency of shopping, and average spending. Besides, we examined the preferred attributes in the fashion purchasing process. In section 2, participants were asked a series of yes-no questions regarding their awareness and interest in sustainable fashion and if they had previously bought sustainable fashion or second-hand. To dig more into consumers' shopping preferences, we included a 16-item scale which explores the 5 dimensions that account for slow fashion, that are equity, authenticity, functionality, localism, and exclusivity. Respondents indicated their agreement or disagreement on a 5-point Likert scale. Based on the literature review, finally, we created a multiple choice question with 11 options asking consumers why they do not buy sustainable fashion at all or more often. The third part consisted on 4 scales: environmental concern scale, subjective norm, perceived consumer effectiveness, and purchase intentions, in which participants have to answer on a 5-point Likert scale. And the last part of the survey asked for sociodemographic data. The data collection took place in February 2020 in the form of an online survey. The research sample consisted of Spanish consumers from 16 years old from all Spanish regions in a balanced proportion to ensure the research sample's relevance and representativeness, and participation was voluntary. The final sample size was 1,063 answers. And from here, we are going to present the main results. Firstly, we examined the awareness of Spanish consumers of sustainable fashion. 90% of the sample declared had heard of sustainable fashion. 73 claimed to be able to define with their own words what sustainable fashion is. 74% claimed to be interested in sustainable fashion, and 39% are assured to have bought at least once a sustainable fashion item. When questioned about why they do not buy sustainable fashion or why they don't do it more often, the most repeated answer was because I cannot discern when a brand is really sustainable or when it just claims to be so in order to improve its image, followed by because it is too expensive and because it is not available where I live. Only 92 consumers, that is 8.65% of the sample, declared to buy sustainable fashion regularly. Previous studies had pointed out price, lack of availability, and not appealing designs as barriers to buying sustainable fashion. However, for the Spanish consumers, it seems that lack of credibility and trust in fashion brands is the main barrier. In contrast, for the 92 already sustainable fashion consumers, the main reasons not to buy from sustainable fashion brands are because they prefer to buy second-hand, because they think it is too expensive, and because they do not trust companies' sustainability claims. It seems that the more aware consumers are of sustainability issues, the less they want to buy brand new items. So, more sustainable consumers tend to prefer buying second-hand than buying from sustainable brands. Mainly because second-hand is less expensive, they can find a wide variety of styles, and it is easier to find clothes in their size. Demographically, the 92 avid sustainable fashion consumers were men and women in a balanced proportion, highly educated, and mostly above 35 years old. As mentioned before, Jung and Jean developed a 16-item scale that explores the five dimensions of slow fashion: equity, authenticity, functionality, localism, and exclusivity. Sustainable fashion consumers score high on all five dimensions, being the less important exclusivity. On the other hand, for the average consumer, functionality comes first, followed by localism, authenticity, exclusivity, and the less important equity. I tend to keep clothes as long as possible rather than discarding them quickly was the statement with the highest score for both groups. And overall, it seems that for the average consumer, it's more important to maximize product lifespan and efficiency, disregarding or paying less attention to the other dimensions of sustainable fashion. Equity was the least preferred factor, even though specific campaigns have targeted the fashion industry working conditions, such as Who Made My Clothes by Fashion Revolution. This topic is yet out of the top of mind of the consumers. The same result appeared during the focus group. When talking about sustainability, environmental issues came first, while there was a detachment towards the social side of sustainable fashion. On the other hand, sustainable fashion consumers demand more transparency and information on their clothing handbags. Besides the manufacturing country and the material composition, they would like to see who were the raw material suppliers and where the processing and the making took place. Regarding the fashion consciousness scale, fashion consciousness can be defined as a person's degree of involvement with fashion, style, or clothing. An individual does not have to be either a fashion opinion leader or a fashion innovator to be considered fashion conscious. Instead, fashion consciousness relates to a person's interest in clothing, fashion, and his or her appearance. Therefore, the questions in this scale relate to cognitive, conative, and behavioral aspects of fashion, whether responders perceive themselves to be fashionable, whether responders are aware of an interest in fashion, and whether responders are motivated to consume fashion. The fashion consciousness scale is divided into 3 subscales: overall fashion interest, average monthly spending in fashion, and purchasing frequency. Sustainable fashion consumers score higher in all 4 items. They seem to like fashion more, search for information, and talk about it with family and friends. Regarding the monthly spending, sustainable fashion consumers spend 38.5 euros monthly, while the average consumer spends 30.4 euros. And it can be highlighted that 11% of the sustainable fashion consumers declare to spend more than 150 euros per month. Finally, both groups of consumers predilected buying in a store than buying online. Most consumers do not buy every month, and the average consumer seems to buy slightly more often than sustainable consumers. So, in conclusion, sustainable fashion consumers have a more significant fashion consciousness than the average consumer. They are more willing to spend higher amounts of money while fashion buying and do their own research about fashion brands and products. They are less price sensitive, leaner towards style than trends, and tend to do extensive research before buying. The environmental concern scale comprises 6 items and measures to what extent consumers are worried about the environmental conditions. Sustainable consumers have a slightly greater concern for the environment and are more willing to make sacrifices to protect it. But overall, both groups seem to have a high environmental concern, which could be a result from the increased media coverage of environmental issues in recent years. Subjective norm is usually defined as an individual's perception or opinion about what important others believe the individual should do, that is, to perform or not to perform a behavior in a specific situation. So sustainable consumers seem to have a stronger perception of pressure to behave sustainably. However, this pressure comes more from within as a moral obligation than from their close circle of family, friends, or society. And these results may reflect that maybe Spain still lacks a culture of sustainability, since consumers do not feel that others, being family, friends, or society in general, exert pressure on them to behave more sustainably. Perceived consumer effectiveness is generally defined as the degree that consumers believe their behavior will effectively mitigate environmental or social problems. As an example, if a consumer believes that their purchase of sustainable apparel will, in fact, help reduce the environment and the environmental impact of the fashion industry, then that consumer may be more likely to purchase sustainable fashion. Both sustainable consumers and the average consumer believe that their actions do have an impact, so they express a high perceived consumer effectiveness. However, in the two product-specific statements, I believe that I can positively impact the environment if I consume products that are sustainable. And I believe that buying sustainable clothing can help combat environmental problems. The average consumer score significantly lower than sustainable fashion consumers. Finally, this scale measures consumers' intentions to purchase sustainable apparel, and sustainable fashion consumers clearly state that they will continue to buy apparel and recommend it to their family and friends, whereas the average consumer does not show the same level of commitment. And to summarize, we have reached the following 5 conclusions. There is a market for sustainable fashion, however, it is still a small niche. Sustainable consumers demonstrate greater fashion consciousness, environmental concern, perceived consumer effectiveness, and a higher subjective norm. However, the perception of pressure to buy sustainably comes more from within their moral values than from their inner cycle or society overall, which may indicate that Spain still lacks a strong sustainability culture. It also appears that the more sustainably conscious consumers are, the less they buy brand new, preferring alternatives as second-hand. And for the average consumer, price is still a critical purchasing driver. And finally, respondents indicate that lack of trust in companies and their sustainability statements is the main reason preventing them from buying sustainable products or doing it more often. So businesses should invest in more palpable actions in order to be perceived as more transparent. And that's it from my part. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, they will be welcome.
Thank you, Sylvia. We have a few minutes for like 1 or 2 minutes for questions if anybody sits with one thing that they would like to ask. Then I would like to ask, what seen from your seat during this research, how would you engage with it? How do you see that a good place to start for the businesses would be the best?
For sustainable fashion companies or for fashion businesses in general?
For you mentioned here at last that the companies should take action. So seen from your side, with this knowledge from the surveys and from the interviews, what can you see that the companies could do first and foremost, maybe?
So as I mentioned, sustainable consumers demand more transparency, and that transparency can be expressed in the hand tags of clothing. So that could be a starting point, because right now we don't know where the raw materials come from, where the making took process, and all these aspects of the supply chain that are always very obscure for the consumer. And I think also for companies itself, they don't know, many times they don't know these aspects as well. So they should try to track their supply chains, and if possible, translate that into the hand tags, so consumers can judge by themselves if the item is sustainable or not. Also because consumers prefer apparel that is produced in their own country. For example, Spanish consumers prefer if the whole item comes from Spain, from the raw material to the finishing, they say that they will pay more for it. So I think that it would be interesting to have this information on hand tags, for example. And right now I'm trying to think about more actions that
really
companies.
a good point. Yeah, I think that's also to what I have understood through my research. So really interesting project. I can see that there's coming some questions in the chat, but you will have to answer them in the chat, because we will have to
move on.
process on to the next one, Elaine. Since we have little time, being 4 presenters in one session. So, but I can see that Elaine is ready. So the word is yours.
Thank you. I wanted to start by showing you a clip. So I'm just going to share the screen.
62 grand an hour. Oh my God, that's the best I've ever seen. 62,000? Yeah. Is that a joke? I can't believe that.
One of Britain's youngest fast fashion companies is about to hit the critical summer season. Style will be launching a new collection every 2 weeks.
Hit the ass, that's great. It's my best one yet.
Which will pop on social media.
If I don't get a photo op today, I'm in the wrong job.
We are just shy of £1 million.
And which will struggle to break through.
The launch is in 12 minutes and the app is down.
Adam will sack me.
Can they answer the industry's critics?
When people think, oh, it's fast fashion, that means they're not sustainable, that means they don't care. I like to challenge that.
And beat their billion-pound rivals.
The bikini costs £5.80.
Gosh, right.
Delivering low-cost glamour at high speed.
What would you like me to pull out of my arse?
This time.
Woohoo!
One of the biggest launches in the company's history.
Yeah. If that first hour was like maybe over 40 grand, I'd be happy. I am going to kill someone.
So this is, can you see my other slides now? No. I'm going to share my slides now. So this is a TV programme on the BBC in the UK, and it's called Breaking Fashion. And sorry, I've gone too far forward. Basically, it's about a fast fashion business in the UK called Just in Style. And one of the things that struck me, because like Sylvia, my research looks at sustainability. So one of the things that struck me from that was with a new collection coming out every 2 weeks, what impact does that then have on the environment? But also, I was very interested in this idea that they didn't seem to market the brand in as much as they marketed their influencers. And the other thing was that all the value was focused on the influencers. So, for example, a photo shoot in the south of France with an influencer cost them £20,000, and yet in other conversations with suppliers, they were constantly trying to reduce the production price, not necessarily for them to make a profit because their profit margins are very slow, but in order to increase the volume of the clothing that they sold. And you can see some of the numbers there within that clip of how much it is that they're selling. So we considered that this was quite an interesting concept, although it doesn't contribute to sustainability. But I guess by understanding what makes consumers consume it in the way that they do, gives us an idea of how to address overall consumption from that. So what, from a kind of research position, we were quite interested in this idea of the influencer as a source credibility. And we noted that in the style we're evolving the fast fashion model to be more social media influencer driven than focused necessarily on the brand. And this is where all the value for the brand was focused on, was this engagement or partnership, as they referred to it, with the influencers, rather than any kind of concern for what happened within the supply chain. And in fact, at the beginning of that clip, well, not the beginning, but he did say, I like to challenge sustainability. But when I had a look on the website, the sustainability aspect was all focused on the consumer and what the consumer should do post-consumption and post-use of the commodity. So there was advice about recycling and downcycling as well. But there was no acknowledgement of sustainability as part of the supply chain management. So we questioned, how does this represent progression in fashion industry and business models? How does this advance the theoretical underpinnings of the zeitgeist, this idea of the time in which we're living in now, how lifestyles are constructed and communicated to others? Of course, social media plays a role within that, and also what implications this has for the future of the fashion industry. So we're looking at it of a theoretical lens of modernity, post-modernity, and now pseudo-modernity. So if we think about the kind of traction of modernity, which kind of came from this idea that it was moving beyond primitive society and starting to organise itself, bring order to the world in which we live and the way in which we communicate with one another. There was also a lot of technological advancement, which started the trajectory of capitalism and the use of nature in order to produce for productivity, to increase productivity. And so prior to that, it would have been production would have been more of a kind of cottage industry basis, but the use of technology and harnessing nature allowed production to go into a much larger scale. And then, of course, within postmodern times, we see consumption is playing a stronger role in the economic model of countries, from production through to the consumption process. But also postmodernity seeks to reject modernity, and it's not looking for absolute truths. It's more experiential, and it's more, the value is on the experience and the meaning that's made meaningful by that experience itself. But what another thing is coming out of postmodernity is that humankind can't control nature. And in fact, we've seen over the last maybe 30 decades the consequences that's had on the environment, and how we have only 10 years left to make a difference to combat the detrimental consequences of overconsumption. And so theorists think that we're now moving beyond postmodernity, but there's some kind of argument as to what postmodernity is and how to term the process in which we're now going through. There's postmodernity. But one that's quite interesting is this idea of pseudo-modernity, which has been conceptualized by Kirby. And thinking about the Justin style and the business model that they've adopted, it does seem to fit into that kind of framework in which consumers do engage with the business. So we see within postmodernity a move towards consumption and visual representations, that consumption adds props that set the scenes of our lifestyles. It's an emergence of fusion of historic and popular icons, but they are made relevant to the time in which we live by tweaks and adaptations. So, for example, if we think about this work of art by Tracey Emin, it's a self-portrait, but we don't see Tracey Emin within the construction of this. What we see are aspects of her lifestyle to kind of create what her lived experience would feel like. And that characterises postmodernity, in that we use these commodity props to set the scenes of our lives and signal to other people what we're about. And of course, this has had a huge impact on fashion. We've had advances in technology that have allowed global production, t-shirts that move around the world at least twice before becoming available to the consumer. So that's characterising globalisation and innovation. We've also seen the restructuring of supply chain management, outsourcing to developing countries because production costs are cheaper. We've seen global brands moving into new developing markets and destabilising what's happening within particular countries. We've seen this rise of the consumer society and symbolic consumption. We've also seen consumption as an image-producing act, and whilst that may have always been the case, if you think back to Veblen and it characterising conspicuous and consumption in 1889, we have always used props, commodities, people around us as signals to our status within society. But with democratisation of the fashion industry, that is accelerated and is dynamic. It's subject to change within that. But these do provide ways in which we can express ourselves to others. However, it doesn't address sustainability, and climate scientists say we've only got 10 years left to make any difference within this. And the current fast fashion model that's emerged from postmodernity means that we excavate scarce resources at an accelerated demand. We make clothing that's inexpensive and therefore easy to access, but equally it's disposable. It has no meaning to us, that its value is decreased. We have marketing tactics that encourage more consumption, such as those accelerated new styles coming into store, moving from biannually to, in Justin Styles' case, fortnightly. And we dispose of those unwanted items to landfill. And this means that more consumption is stimulated because we've disposed of the old products. And of course, then we in developing countries would sell our waste back to developing countries. So this cycle is inherently unsustainable. And this year was meant to be the year that there was a more of a focus on sustainability, that the consequences of sustainability have grown in momentum over the last couple of years, and we've seen a lot more protests. For example, Extinction Rebellion, the pupil protests, all demanding that governments take control. So Kirby has talked quite a bit about this idea of pseudo-modernity, and that it's a kind of hyperized post-modernity. And he characterises it within 5 particular traits. That pseudo-modernity is inferior because it's not intellectually challenging. And in a sense, it generates us to become fairly passive in our consumption role. So, for example, scrolling on social media, watching clips and then clicking onto the next thing. And in a sense, that's all instantly forgettable. We have advances, we have a need for transparency and authenticity. And this has kind of changed the way in which we are not just buying commodities as characterised within postmodernity, but we're actually buying stories that help to construct our living narrative. it's also co-created because it demands audience engagement. And if we think about a number of entertainment programs on TV, such as Big Brother, The Circle, X Factor, Britain's Got Talent, none of them can exist on their own. They're all very much dependent on the audience's interaction and selecting the winners and deciding who goes through. It's also experiential because it's the creation of a unique offering, such as an influencer to portray their lifestyle, and it also encourages touch points. I see I've got 1 minute left. So in the style has grown significantly. I'm just going to get onto the way that we kind of found this. We watched the 6 programs, each of them focused on a different influencer. And what we found was that this was, an accelerated speed and collaboration. Supported by the influencers, it meant that the new collection with a different influencer was coming out every fortnight. And the speed of the revenue from that, which was seen in the clip there, was 62,000 within the first hour, £62,000 worth of garments that were sold within an hour. They also adopted a very aggressive approach to supply chain management and marketing. So, for example, in order to meet the photo shoot with one of the influencers, Lorna Lux, they got in touch with a Chinese factory on the Tuesday and demanded it be made and sent to the UK by the Saturday morning. And so there was all the value was put on the influencer and the trip for the marketing campaign to the south of France, whereas the contractors were continuously being squeezed in for time and money within that. Because they worked with these influencers, that they called them partnerships, and they obviously got a cut of the sales. So they also had a very vested interest in sales, and they were using their followers, the large number of followers that they had, in order to tease information about the campaign as it was taking place, and also the photo shoot. But they were trying to push sales through their social media followings. The influencers, it wasn't just the clothes that they were sold. I mean, the clothes were really cheap. Some of the photo shoots took place in the south of France in mansions, and so they were really depicting a luxurious lifestyle with clothes that were fast fashion and very, very inexpensive. The influencers were considered as taste makers, and they were using these props as an illustration of their life, but they were surrounded by these very expensive props. So they were selling a lifestyle that was aspirational rather than a lived reality. And of course, the idea of it happening on social media and the sales happening through social media meant that there was a diminished consumer decision making. So this very much links into pseudo-modernity in that there's very little value in it, very little authenticity. It's a living narrative. It's very much dependent on consumers engaging, sharing and liking the information. And it's in a sense fairly superficial towards the fast fashion industry. So that's my references, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Elaine.
You're
Wow.
welcome.
What a mouthful to know of how the influences impact fast fashion. Wow. I can see that Isabel has a question for you about in the chat about education. I don't know if you will address that question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think education is really important, and of course, it's integral to all the way in which we teach our students in marketing, fashion, and tourism and events. And also, I've done previous research in sustainability in primary schools in Scotland, and I think it is really important. But I think that the lure of social media is also quite big, and I think that also a lot of consumers take these superficial assumptions that they are addressing sustainability that supports the attitude behaviour gap that Sylvia spoke about. It means that they can kind of defer responsibility to the business because they say that they're addressing it. However, nobody's really looking into exactly what that might mean.
May I just add another comment, because some years ago I did a research about consumption, fashion consumption in universities. And one of the things that we notice is that when people have a very strong relationship with celebrities, this means that they are underdeveloped in social terms, because this means that they don't have reference models near to them, like, you know, family, friends, you know, social relationships who are really meaningful. So they just project, you know, all the process of creation of identity into these celebrities that they don't have really a relationship with. And so in psychological terms, it's even, you know, not very good for young people. I don't know how we could handle this, because I was really struck, you know, by your example.
Yes, and I'd be interested in reading your research there. It seems really interesting, but I guess also the rise of social media in young people's lives is also quite a big pull and an influence within that. But it definitely warrants further research to further examine, you know, the way in which that's made meaningful. And I guess we could also look at sustainability influencers, because we do see them now, not in such a you know, great force, but they do exist and they will have an impact on others. It definitely warrants more research. Maybe we should, you know, get together.
Really interesting. Thank you, Elaine. And I can also see that you have some questions in the chat, but as time is running, we will have to pass on to the next speaker. I can see that Liliana is ready. I guess you will be the one presenting from your group.
Yes.
Yes. Well, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm gonna just put my presentation up. Let me just share. Okay. Okay, so can you see what I'm presenting in the screen? Okay, perfect. So good afternoon to everybody. My name is Liliana Pina, and I'm really glad to be here to show you some aspects about my PhD research. Okay, this presentation is about a paper, but that paper is on the scope of my PhD research entitled Do I Fit In? A Study of Visually Impaired Individuals and Their Relationship with Fashion Brands. I'm from Portugal, from University of Beira Interior, and I'm also lecture classes related with garment construction, has pattern making and sewing construction. So, however, the title of this particular study is Browsing Clothing with Senses, a Sensorial Brand Experience Concerning Visually Impaired Individuals. These are the full authors of the paper. Let me just say that Professor Lucas and Professor Paulo Duarte are my supervisors, of my PhD supervisors. And let me just speak a little bit about my motivation, why a theme related with visually impaired, right? Basically, and I'm going to be really precise here, and then in the end of the presentation, I will explain if someone has are curious or something about the theme. The interest of on doing a research on this thematic was born through a real experience with a visually impaired person. Do I think that I fit? This was the main question. But there are other questions, right? if they are not cited, how are they connected with a fashion brand? And what is more important, if this connection exists, that probably exists, right? What are the brand attributes and the product features that can be preferable for the visually impaired consumer? And after all, what motivates them to buy fashionable products? So this particular paper was the focus on identify what kind of stimulus brands usually provide to the consumers, considering a holistic point of view. Secondly, understand within those stimulus which ones could be more accurate and eventually use in a further empirical study with a visually impaired sample or participants. And thirdly, it was tried to find a coherent qualitative methodology that could be integrated in that empirical study towards to visually impaired individuals. Regarding the paper methodology, was focused on the literature review based on scientific papers, books, and informative articles, and report analysis and particular books help to understand better visually impaired individuals and make a proper contextualization of their social issues, of course. Regarding the keywords, visually impaired brand, clothing, stores, senses, experience, and emotions were the preferable keywords for the searching. Let me just explain to you a little bit of visually impaired individuals and their social contextualization, okay? Globally, according with the most recent data of World Health Organization, globally there are at least 123 million people with severe distance, with moderate or severe distance vision impairment or blindness, and 826 million people are near to vision impairment. And what is more is a great majority of countries in OECD still have significant challenges to meet the objectives of reducing inequalities. So these kind of social issues, for example, social misconceptions about a disability, lead visually impaired individuals to a physical and mental unhealthy state. And as a consequence, they do not achieve satisfaction in their lives. After all, is a question of how society sees these individuals not for their capabilities, but for their disability sometimes. So to make people understand visual disabilities, apart from scientific authors that work in that scope, some activists and motivational speakers, such as Molly Burke, try to demystify this wrong idea about visual impairments and visually impaired individuals. Regarding the literature review and visually impaired preferences of clothing designs, was found that appearance and clothing has been seen by visually impaired individuals as an ally, and they use it to defy possible misconceptions. They usually have some difficulties to say that they have their own style, because normally they rely on others' opinions, like a familiar or a friend or the store assistant. Influencing factors for the garment purchase are related with fit, age, and occasion elements. For example, regarding fit, is very, very important that the garment has form-fitting and flattering to their shape, and the garment, they prefer garments that are not too revealing. The age, participants normally want to dress age properly. And regarding the age, visually impaired normally prefer dress age properly. Regarding the occasion, they also need to adhere to a certain style regarding, for example, a business attire or a certain occasion, for example, a ceremony or something like that. Casual style has been seen as their favorite, and of course fabric tactile properties and applications on the surface of the garments or of the textile material are interesting features for the touching experience. Still on this matter, what can be said? Oops, sorry, too fast. Comfort, fit, donning and doffing, closure, tactile identification, and storage are presented as the most important functional features in garments. However, symbolic values contribute for their visually impaired self-esteem, as well the possibility of color identification of garments, aesthetic beauty, and tactile decoration has been seen by visually impaired as a more plausible integration into modern society. So, regarding their shopping experiences, okay, visually impaired needs, experiences, and problems have not been addressed properly by fashion brands concerning the access to the market and, for example, the product information. We draw the capacity of visually impaired to perceive and process certain information. While the lack of support services in the store environment prevents visually impaired consumers from being socially active, which is quite the opposite of Yunya Kawamura defense when she explains that fashion does provide extra added values to clothing. So consumers want to experience the pleasure of shopping and personalize their experiences according to their unique desires. Still on the shopping experience, it is known that visually impaired needs can only be satisfactorily accomplished when they visit a brick-and-mortar retail store. Hearing, touching, and smelling sensory inputs may trigger memories and lead these individuals to different experience moods, and the individuals in an holistic view, of course. And of course, the retail atmospheres may have an important cognitive, attitudinal, and emotional impact on product purchase. So, regarding the brand, and due to the lack of information about visually impaired relationships with fashion brands in the scientific community, authors defend in an holistic way that a brand serves as a single most important criterion for the purchase decisions among many consumers. Hearing and touch are in fact powerful tools and high detail providers for visually impaired individuals. And the brand emotion is perhaps the bond between brands, products, and the consumers. So, for example, brand assets like brand names, websites, logos, slogans, or taglines, jingles, and packages are central elements to enhance consumer brand awareness and possible brand associations. If fashion brands concern their marketing strategies in memorable, easy to recognize, and easy to recall brand assets, the information about the benefits, attributes, and category of the brand and its products should be more meaningful. Increasing positive visually impaired experience towards to the product and the brand itself could enhance fashion brands to be more interactive, immersive, authentic, and inclusive to these particular consumers and others. So, regarding the findings, the development of, as was mentioned in the paper, several fashion designers came up with plausible ideas focusing the development of particular garments that decrease the difficulties that visually impaired has into understand clothing. However, the development of the products are mostly based into aesthetics and functionality aspects, but exists a total alienation of these products' integration into the fashion market and their relation with the brand. And what is more is the consumer behavior is based in the multisensory experiences involving a particular number of senses. So it is mandatory that brands try to implement a sensorial communication approach. As designers, sometimes, I mean, not sometimes, most of the time, it must be understood that it's important and imperative to focus the design process of a particular garment into a chameleon methodology, focusing the specific needs of disabled individuals, but concealing them with other consumers. So I realized that it was not possible to analyze the relationship not only with clothing properties, I mean the relationship with the consumer and the brand, not only with clothing properties, but includes in further studies the analysis of the relationship of visually impaired consumers with the brand, with brand assets and the store environment features, concerning their interpretation and interaction with these three important aspects. So this is the diagram of the qualitative methodology approach for a possible empirical study that had a phenomenology method, explanatory and descriptive, with a semi-structured in-depth interviews with open and closed questions. The toolkit appears here as a tool that will be implemented during the interview. So regarding the conclusions, identify several, it was possible to identify several considerations and issues related to visually impaired individuals and their actual concerns and preoccupations regarding clothing and their consumer experience, mostly in brick and mortar stores. Brand concerns considering visually impaired were not yet addressed by other researchers, so there's a lack of information in the field of fashion, branding, and the scientific community. Regarding the qualitative approach, this kind of methodology combined with a sensorial toolkit and the implementation of an experiment on further empirical studies seems logical when considering visually impaired individuals. And then maybe this solution may allow researchers and fashion designers in the future to understand more clearly the visually impaired consumers and be closer to their preferences. Regarding the limitations, there was no opportunity to perform a practical study, an empirical study, and share these results in the paper. However, it is definitely a consideration and an improvement to be done on further studies. And it's still premature to come up with possible materials to implement in the sensorial toolkit. However, the analysis of trends has been done, the communication with possible, sorry, I don't remember the name, manufacturers of textiles has also suppliers, sorry, with possible suppliers has also been done, and I have really positive feedback from them. And yeah, I'm just waiting to receive all the samples that I had already ordered, and then I will be able to start the sensorial toolkit and do the interviews. These are the references of the study, in particular of this presentation. And thank you for your attention, and I'm waiting for your questions. I just, okay, great.
Thank you, Liliana.
You're welcome, Isabel.
Thank you, Liliana. I can see that Veronica has a question for you in the chat.
Yeah, I'm reading it.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Veronica, for your really interesting question. I'm not sure if they are really interesting. I'm just trying to deal with the fact that right now, most of the designers that try to develop solutions concerning clothing, specific clothing for visually impaired individuals, they do not have that products in the market. Possibly because they do not have interesting on it, or just because the clothing are not plausible to be purchasing in the store environment. And I'm not sure if, I mean, a full multisensory experience to visually impaired consumers. I'm not sure if it will be possible to do that, but I'm worried about the information and the lack of information about the product and the visually impaired person that usually goes to the store to buy. And for example, Elaine Rich was speaking about transparency and authenticity, about sustainability. How they will know if a piece of garment is sustainable if most of the fashion brands has visual elements in their marketing strategies. I mean, they need to deal with other kind of solutions like hearing or, for example, touching. So I hopefully I believe that will be the path to follow, but only with the study will be have more, with empirical study we have more conclusions about their feelings and their experience with the brand, and not with only with clothing.
I think you have more questions in the chat for you, Liliana.
Oh, sorry, I didn't. I believe that are probably some brands that will train their staff and they concerns about disabilities, but and usually I mean, I worked already in a fashion store brand, and we do not have a particular training regarding these questions. These problems. I don't know if the thing. How to explain? I don't know if the positive feedback about brands passes through their staff. Of course, if staff are more interesting into help, it's different for the brand. But I believe that if the visually impaired person feels more independent in their purchase, that will be possibly a positive point for the brand. Hopefully I answer your question, Emmanuel. You are making important inroads.
Thank you, Liliana.
I think, yeah. Oh, sorry, I don't know if we have time.
The time is actually running, but if you have a closing remark, please.
Yes, I do. I just want, because Veronica Manlo, you're making, I believe that after this work, after this study, this empirical study, we need to understand designer's point of view, because I mean, I need to perceive and understand the visually impaired individual, but I need to focus myself then in the designers, because if I came up with a solution, they will be probably interesting on it, because they will expand their possibilities in terms of purchase and consumers. So Okay. Thank you for your attention, and
Thank you,
I
Liliana.
think that's it. Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for being the next to present, because you did a really good job to make the stage for me, since I'm the designer, also working with the emotional side of users' impression of clothing. Okay. So I'll just start to share my screen with you. So from presenting my research today, I focus on the potential of involving users' insights in the design process as a strategy for user empowerment in fashion. Here I explore how fashion and textile design practice can contribute to sustainable transition as the one the industry faces. In doing so, I do this through an experimental and practice-based research of how designers can engage with users to gain insights of the use phase and further employ these as inspiration for design development. As a part of my research project, I have developed a design concept that serves as a framework to investigate this. And me myself, having a background in textile design as a knitwear designer, I take my starting point in industrial manufacturing of knitwear and use newer digital technology that opens up for on-demand production and a user-driven design approach. This design concept, developed for the purpose of this research, allows users to customize knitted jumpers according to individual body measurements and different aesthetic preferences. I base my research on theory suggesting that designers adventurously can incorporate knowledge from the use phase in relation to working with alternative use patterns. What I find important here is to illuminate how to work with this theory in practice. In this project, I seek ways in which the designer can use their competences to address another fashion system. The existing system is, to also what we have seen from earlier on in this session, to a great extent driven by fashion trends that plays a vital role of economic growth, most often created from a culture of ideals and agendas that offer the possibility to become more attractive, more powerful, and in some way different. According to Fletcher and Tam, we need to broaden this perspective and address not only the environmental impact of a fashion product and the process of making it, but also the psychology of fashion use. This affects the traditional fashion system in a way where isolated solutions cannot solve the challenge alone. It requires a shift of paradigm that frames all levels of fashion. It involves our worldview and assumption of how we see and perceive fashion. To address this, I tend to design skills and methods of being able to work with and navigate within complex issues that are unstable and dynamic of character, like the ones we meet when we engage with new territory. In a traditional design process, prototyping is one of the designer's tools to make ideas more tangible. Here I pursue a similar research approach with an aim to contribute to the discussion of future practice of design. My methodology is twofold, as it builds around the design concept, alternating between design experiments with users and experiments in the knit workshop. In the first experiment, I engaged with users to gain insights of use of knitwear. The purpose of the second design experiment is to apply the collected knowledge as inspiration for development of the concept of knitted jumpers. As studies show that problems with size and fit are one of the most common reasons why we get rid of clothes, especially for women. Clothes today are made to standard sizes that often do not fit women's various body shapes. This problem has influenced my choice of participants for the study, as newer knitwear technology provides the opportunity to meet different needs and preferences through mass customization. I choose to include women who represent 3 different archetypes, what you could call them, scoping a much larger group of users. In design experiment 1, I seek in-depth insight to 3 female users' experiences with and personal preferences for knitted garments. The design experiment took place in the participants' own home with access to their wardrobe. Here I combined a wardrobe interview with the interview technique called repertory grid, which guided the participants to describe experiences with knitted textile samples and jumpers. To illuminate the participants' experiences with knitwear and their tacit knowledge of use, I brought prototypes in the form of knitted textile samples and jumpers to guide the conversation. Because prior to the meeting, I did not know what the participant had in the wardrobes. So bringing these prototypes to the conversation with the participants helped me to guide it and to make a common ground for the conversation with users that are maybe not used to verbalize expressions about textiles, textility, style preferences, and so forth. This tacit knowledge that I mentioned before. Design experiment 1 showed that the participant primarily expressed their preferences in relation to aesthetic experiences. During the interview with Kirsten here, she asked if she could try on the jumper that I brought with me. In this situation, I could observe how Kirsten tried on the jumper while she described her experience. She thought the jumper looked cool, and when she tried it on, the detail of the knitted structure and the proportions did not suit her at all. This example depicts 2 angles of the concept of preferences. One angle deals with the general aesthetic preference of personal taste, for example, stylistic expressions. The second angle relates to use. And here I'm particularly interested in the participants' preferences that relate to use situations. This qualitative approach has provided detailed insights into these use situations. The participants' preferences can be divided into categories for visual expression, style of jumper, proportions, and fit, as well as material tactility. The user story showed, for example, that participants' experiences with jumpers had given them an awareness of which style and fit they prefer and think suits them best. The experiment showed that it's also these types of jumpers that they use the most often. This indicates that designers advantageously can increase awareness to suit different aesthetic preferences and body shapes for designing garments. In design experiment 2, I explore how designers can activate these user insights as a part of the inspirational source for design development of jumpers. based on mass customization. This part of the research is carried out in the knit workshop at Design School Kolding, the university where I'm based. And this allows me to firsthand explore the textile designer's own process when knowledge about the use phase is included, as it also challenges the traditional process in several new ways. In a traditional design process, source of inspiration are an essential part of the knitwear designer's process and idea development. This strategic way of acquiring inspiration is an important skill for the knitwear designer, as it makes it possible to formulate different goals as a part of an iterative process. The user insights from Design Experiment 1 are further explored through textile experimentation. As the analysis process already begins during the actual interview, my interpretations of the users in the present situation are employed as well. For one thing, I used my interpretation to translate insights of the user's personal style into a visual mood board, communicating characteristics of colors, textures, temperament, and so forth. This being different to a traditional design process where designers most often go and be inspired by color trends from trend forecasting bureaus. I also applied images as a conceptual representation of customization, knitwear, and aesthetics, and fit. The textile experimentation makes it possible to study and test ideas using the mood board for reflection and analysis. Here, prototypes are used to assess, for example, colors in the form of knitted textiles, as if they were jumpers already. As can be seen, the perception of color changes from one knitted structure to another. I have worked with different user insights through textile experimentation to translate these into design parameters for customization. One of the user's insights showed that a need for expression that are both toned down and more dominant is something that reaches for many different types of users. It is therefore the basic idea that the parameters that is presented through this design concept vary in different expressions, spanning between neutral and complex expressions. The idea of various design parameters are explored through the textile experiments as shown in the examples. The prototypes have played a central role in developing the concept as they made ideas concrete and tangible. This was an important tool for the development of a complex system of both developing the whole collection structure and the individual jumper design at the same time. The design experiments exemplify how the designer can engage with different levels of transformation by making concrete and tangible examples of how a fashion product is made, how a fashion system can be organized, and might even contribute to change in culture and people's mindsets. The last mentioned level, culture and mindsets, are the most intangible one that most likely will not be implemented in the same speed as the others, even though a change of mindset and are considered at the most efficient and effective way of transforming a system. Thus, to address challenges at all levels, a systematic approach is essential. It is a huge shift in thinking, as it not only concerns the environmental impact of a garment, but also a more holistic view of the whole fashion system. A more diverse system might support different ways of finding joyful engagement with clothing. It may even encourage for users to feel empowered and inspire others to feel the same. The research project indicated that designers and companies should be aware of the potential of user dialogue and how this knowledge can be translated into sustainable business models. My aim with this research is to contribute to the discussion about how theoretical perspectives on change of the fashion system can be transformed into practice. I've had it here demonstrated how the designer can change practice to involve user insights of the user as a vital part of their creative process of making knitwear. Applying this, I have experienced the importance of meeting the participants myself, as this gave me nuances to my interpretation and analysis of their preferences, needs, and motivations for use of knitwear. When I contacted the participants and asked if they wanted to be a part of the research project, they were unsure of what knowledge they could bring to the table. During the experiment, they become more secure of themselves and their own voices in fashion as a result of personal preferences and needs. The use of the prototypes and the questioning technique functioned as a game where the participant could experience that no answers were perceived correctly or incorrectly. At the same time, it made them familiar with what kind of knowledge they have, exactly knowledge of use. So thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. I hope you will engage in my research with questions. I will be happy to answer them. So as can be seen that these 4 presentations in this session are very different, and in the same way they are touching upon some of the same issues from different angles. So I find that really amusing myself. Mine being very practical towards the other engagements with consumers.
I would like to ask you a question, Louise, because in your training as a fashion designer, or even in terms of your experience, what is the main difference that you found when you interact with consumers? What kind of information you really gather that you didn't have before?
I think actually the headline of that would be the person, because being a designer, sitting in your design studio, you can easily be drawn to trends or the artistic work or art in itself, and that's not sure that it relates to the person. So this about being eye to eye with the person, or one-to-one with the person wearing clothes, and having that as a focus in the interview and the discussion about, in this case, knitted jumpers. That was actually really surprising to me, and that was also why my overall finding of this was really how important it is for the designer to go and do the study themselves. At Design School Culling, we also teach already educated designers as an after education, where we have taught companies to work with this wardrobe method of going and do interviews with their customers. And what we have seen from this is that then maybe it's the intern or another in a slightly lower hierarchy in the company that would go and do these interviews. And then this person would bring further the information, which then becomes very general and not very in-depth. So I see that it's very important for the designers to actually go and have that meeting with the customers and the users of their clothing.
May I just say that that is quite of the design methodology that has been applied on inclusive design, because they do need to create an empathy and to understand the problems and the issues that, for example, a visually impaired has been doing and been having, sorry. And but we cannot also discard the trends, because then we will be only focus ourselves in their issues and their preferabilities and discard other things that are also important to think on a market perspective.
Yeah, that's a good point. And how did the designers there, how did they feel about doing differently in a business context?
Well, in the case of inclusive clothing, related with visually impaired individuals, the clothing do not succeed in the market. It doesn't exist market to them, because they are really specific. There are some fashion designers. Well, it's a little bit tricky, because I'm pretty sure that some projects are academic projects. They do not evolve for something more, what is a pity. For example, I remember of Balini Naidoo, that is a master's student in South Africa, of the University of South Africa. I'm not sure about the name of the university. And there's another designer, Camila Shiriboga, that study in New York. Pretty sure that is Parsons, but I'm not sure. Okay. And they both of them are try to develop clothing on that sense.
But this is also what is maybe so difficult, because what happens in research, and how is it then that we bring it into practice in a business sense? And what I found is really hard is what comes first. Is it the companies trying out new business concepts, maybe fostering the consumers to go in that direction, or is it the consumers who should go and ask for it first? Should they change their mindsets of other ways to engage with fashion before the concepts? And I find that really difficult, because of course businesses also need to drive their business.
We need to survive in the multiplicity of brands that the fashion business has. But for example, there exists a designer. I think the first name is Alexa. I'm putting the link here. I'm following her in Instagram, and basically she's trying to develop clothing with braille designs on the surface of the garments, but that concerns other problems too, because sometimes a blind person cannot read braille. So how so in fact, it's important that the literacy of Braille has come up, and she's trying to develop that kind of issue. Okay, that kind of sorry, she's trying to develop that literacy that is a little bit lost in the multiplicity of all the things that design has, but she has to think that probably some people doesn't know how to read Braille. So yeah, just a thought that came up.
That's a good point.
I wanted to add as well, in the argument about whether it's consumers or retailers that's responsible, I kind of think that consumers have no idea what's involved in production. And so that makes it really difficult for them to tell whether it's being sustainable or not. And that's due to an assumption of, say, some kind of cottage industry, that they don't really understand that dyes are disposed of in the rivers, or they don't really, the idea of someone being exploited is so far removed from their experience that they can't really quite understand how it feels to have no other options. And so I'm kind of on the side of the consumer. I don't know how you can make a rational decision if you don't understand what fully was involved. And I also think that given the size of fashion in terms of how frequently it's made, in terms of hyper production, I feel like the consumer really is just a pawn in that game.
That was also one thing that I was thinking about during Sylvia's presentation, where Sylvia, you mentioned that the participants in your survey, there was a certain percentage of people who answered that they felt they knew what sustainable fashion was. And I was just thinking that that perception is very different from one person to another. Also, just within the research crowd that I know that is researching within this field. That it's not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that is one of the problems with sustainable fashion, that in the research community, we don't agree in a definition of what sustainable fashion is and what sustainable fashion consumption should be. And that is also a problem with consumers, because I think that, for one consumer, it can mean buying secondhand only, and for other consumers is buying less or buying brand new sustainable fashion. So that is a problem. And it's also a problem, how do we measure what portion of the market currently is sustainable fashion? It is hard to measure if we don't agree on a definition. So it is hard to evaluate how sustainable fashion is evolving in the consumption side and in the production side as well. So the question you asked me after my presentation, I thought that another factor that brands could do to be effectively more sustainable for consumers, and is be certified by third parties, and like label, a sustainable label by a third party. For example, the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. And I think that maybe an organization like the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion could also help to convert the academic community and the business community in a sustainable fashion definition.
We definitely have a good conversation going here. I'm happy that we have 2 more days of conference time, because time is running, and Isabel has been kind to remind me that we have 6 minutes to the next part of the conference program of today. So if we just need a little stretching and water and so forth, then I think we should thank for the good discussion and the good presentations today. I look forward to go through the abstracts to dig more into the knowledge. So thank you for today.